Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you've built, everything you were, everything that defined you has simply vanished. I'm not talking about losing money or a job. I'm talking about losing yourself, your identity, your purpose, the person you saw in the mirror every morning. Because the story I'm going to tell today is about a man who literally lost everything after surgery that should have saved his life, but instead destroyed it, and about how the most unlikely person, someone society doesn't even realize exists, became the only thread that kept him connected to humanity. Before diving into this journey that will break your heart and then rebuild it in unexpected ways, answer me this in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever had a moment when you were screaming for help but no one seemed to hear? Write it below, because this story is about finding light in the darkest places, about dignity where we least expect it, about how sometimes angels don't wear wings. They wear janitor uniforms and carry mops. And if you want stories that touch the soul, that remind you of what really matters in this chaotic life, hit that subscribe button right now. Because here you will find narratives that change perspectives. Come with me on this journey of loss, despair, and the most improbable redemption you've ever seen. Daniel Torres was 38 years old when his life exploded. He was a cardiovascular surgeon at Metropolitan Hospital, one of the best in the city, with hands that saved lives daily, a brilliant mind that solved problems that baffled other doctors, and a reputation that placed him at the top of his profession. He had an elegant apartment overlooking the park, an imported car parked in the underground garage, a closet full of tailored suits, and a social calendar packed with dinners with the medical and academic elite. But more than anything else, Daniel had a purpose. He woke up every day knowing exactly who he was and why he mattered. He was a surgeon. He was a healer. He was someone who made a tangible difference between life and death. This identity defined him more than anything else, more than relationships, more than possessions, more than any title or external achievement. He was his hands, his skill, his calling. And then came the headache. It started subtly, just an occasional annoyance that he ignored because surgeons don't have time for weakness. They don't have the luxury of stopping. But it grew. It became constant, throbbing, accompanied by blurred vision and nausea that wouldn't go away. Finally, after weeks of denial, he had the tests he knew he should have had from the beginning. A brain aneurysm. Large. Dangerously positioned. The irony was palpable. The surgeon who spent his days repairing other people's hearts had a ticking time bomb in his own brain. The doctors were clear. Surgery was risky, but doing nothing was a guaranteed death sentence. It could rupture at any moment. He was lucky to still be alive. Daniel did what he would do for any patient in the same situation. He researched the best neurosurgeons, chose the most experienced, and reviewed the risks and benefits with the clinical clarity that only a doctor can have regarding their own mortality. 92% chance of success, 8% chance of complications, less than 2% chance of serious permanent sequelae. These were good odds. Excellent, in fact. He wasn't in that 2%. He was in an even smaller fraction. That tiny percentage so minuscule it's barely mentioned in pre-surgical conversations. The surgery was technically a success. The aneurysm was repaired. The bleeding stopped. But something went wrong. Something no one foresaw. No one could have predicted. Secondary ischemic stroke, caused by a microscopic clot that broke loose during the procedure and traveled to a critical area of the brain. When Daniel woke up 3 days later in the ICU, his life, as he knew it, was over. The right side of his body wasn't responding properly. His right arm and hand, those precise tools that had performed thousands of surgeries and saved countless lives, trembled uncontrollably when he tried to move them. His fine motor coordination was destroyed. He could hold a pen, but he couldn't write. He could pick up a glass, but he would drop it. And surgery? Forget it. Impossible. Completely impossible. But worse, far worse than the physical dysfunction, was what the stroke had done to his mind. Not to his intelligence, which remained intact and cruelly clear, but to his ability to process and express language. Aphasia, they called it. Damage to Broca's area. They explained with that professional compassion he himself had used thousands of times with devastated families. He understood everything perfectly. Every word spoken to him, every concept, every nuance. His mind functioned with the same brilliant precision as always. But when he tried to speak, when he tried to transform crystal-clear thoughts into words, something broke between his brain and his mouth. Words came out wrong, jumbled, or simply didn't come out at all. Simple sentences became impossible puzzles. He knew what he wanted to say. He saw it perfectly clearly in his mind, but he couldn't make the words obey. Imagine the torture. Being a brilliant doctor trapped in a body that doesn't obey, and a mouth that can't express the genius still alive inside. Seeing nurses speaking slowly to him as if he were a child or an idiot. Seeing fellow doctors averting their eyes in discomfort. Not knowing how to interact with someone who had once been their equal, but was now broken. Seeing pity where there was once respect. The months of rehabilitation were nightmares. Physical therapy for a hand that refused to function properly. Speech therapy, where he struggled for hours to speak sentences that 5-year-olds mastered. Progress was slow, painfully slow. He improved, of course. He regained some motor function. He could dress himself, eat without help, perform basic personal care tasks. His speech improved too, but never returned to normal. He could communicate, but it was laborious, frustrating, full of long pauses as he struggled to find words that danced out of reach. And surgery? The hospital was kind but firm. He could no longer operate. The tremors, the compromised coordination, made it impossible. They offered him an administrative position, consulting work, something to keep him connected to medicine. But Daniel couldn't bear it. He couldn't walk through those corridors, where he had been a doctor and was now a patient. He couldn't see the operating rooms, where he had been a mentor and was now excluded. He couldn't face the stares, the poorly disguised pity, the discomfort of colleagues who didn't know what to say. Then he left. He simply left. Disability retirement at 39. The elegant apartment was sold, too large and expensive to maintain on disability income. The car was sold. He could no longer drive safely anyway. The tailored suits were donated. He had no use for them anymore. He moved into a tiny apartment in a neighborhood he would never have considered before, a small, dark, and cheap place, but one he could afford. And slowly, day after day, Daniel Torres disappeared. Not physically. He still existed, still breathed, still woke up every morning. But the person he had been, the brilliant surgeon, the healer, the man with purpose and a clear identity, that person died. And what remained was an empty shell, a broken man who no longer knew who he was or why he should care about continuing to exist. The days merged into endless gray. He woke up for no real reason other than habit. He ate because his body demanded it, not because he felt pleasure. He watched television without really seeing. He tried to read, but the concentration that had once been sharp as a scalpel now easily vanished. Friends stopped calling after months of refused invitations. Family visited occasionally, forced and uncomfortable conversations where everyone pretended he was fine, getting better, that he had a future ahead of him. But Daniel knew the truth. There was no future. There was only existence, survival without purpose, days piling up without meaning or direction. He had lost everything that defined him, everything that made life worth living. And slowly, quietly, he began to stop caring if he woke up tomorrow. It was in this state, 6 months after the surgery that had destroyed his life, that Daniel was forced by a persistent social worker to participate in an ongoing rehabilitation program at the community center. He didn't want to go. He saw no point. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. She would show up at his door, practically dragging him out. So he went, more out of exhaustion from resisting than out of any real hope. The community center was old, poorly maintained, and smelled of cheap cleaning products and accumulated regrets. The therapy room was small, with folding chairs in a circle, other stroke survivors at various stages of recovery, a therapist who was too young, with an overly bright smile talking about goals and progress and toxic positivity that made Daniel want to scream. But he didn't shout. He couldn't form words fast enough to shout properly anyway. So he sat there, half present, half absent, letting words wash over him without really penetrating him. It was after one of those particularly fruitless sessions, while sitting alone in the hallway, trying to gather energy for the journey back to the empty apartment, that he saw him for the first time. An old man, perhaps 70, possibly more, wearing a faded blue janitor's uniform. Dark skin marked by decades of hard work under the sun and in windowless rooms. Completely white hair, cut short, slightly hunched back but still strong and decisive movements as he pushed the cleaning cart down the hallway. He cleaned with meticulous attention to detail, which Daniel immediately recognized. The attention of someone who takes his work seriously no matter what others think of him. The caretaker stopped near Daniel, picked up a mop, and began to clean the stain on the linoleum floor. And as he worked, he began to hum. A low, soft melody, something old that Daniel didn't recognize, but that had a comforting quality. And then the man spoke, without looking up from his work. Tough times, huh? Daniel looked surprised. People generally didn't talk to him anymore, not really. They made polite conversations out of necessity or avoided him completely. He struggled with words, finally managing to say, yes. Difficult. The caretaker nodded, still cleaning. I know hard. I carried hard things on my back for so long that I've forgotten what it's like not to carry them. He finally looked up, and his eyes were kind, tired, but with genuine warmth. I'm James, by the way. James Washington. Daniel succeeded, and that was all he achieved, but James just smiled as if that were enough. Nice to meet you, Daniel. He wrung out the mop and put it back in the bucket. You'll be all right, you know. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will. No. Daniel's frustration began to rise as he struggled with words that wouldn't come. I can't. I'm not anymore. It's not who it used to be. James finished gently. I know, but it's still someone. You just need to find out who. He started pushing the cart away, then stopped. I'll be here Tuesday and Thursday. If you need someone just to sit, just to be present, I'll be around. Nobody should carry weight alone. And with that, James Washington, the caretaker whom society barely notices, who works in the corners and shadows, keeping the world running without recognition or gratitude, walked down the corridor, leaving Daniel sitting there with something he hadn't felt in months. Something small, fragile, but undeniably real. Curiosity. And perhaps, just perhaps, the smallest spark of something that could be hope. Are you feeling this? This moment where everything can change. Leave a comment if you've ever been saved by the unexpected kindness of a stranger. And if you need to know how this caretaker will change everything for a man who lost everything, hit that like button now. The following weeks established a pattern that Daniel never would have predicted, but which slowly became the only thing in his life that seemed to have real meaning. He returned to the community center on Tuesdays and Thursdays, officially for therapy sessions that he still found useless, but honestly to see James. The caretaker was always there, working quietly, keeping the building running with a dignity and care that few noticed. And he always found time to sit with Daniel, sometimes for 5 minutes during a quick break, sometimes for half an hour after his shift ended. It didn't matter how long. What mattered was the quality of those moments. James didn't treat Daniel like a victim. He didn't use that condescending tone most people adopted, speaking slowly and loudly as if Daniel were deaf or mentally incapable. He didn't pretend everything would be all right with empty platitudes. Instead, James spoke to Daniel as an equal, as a complete human being who deserved respect despite his limitations. Did you work as a surgeon? James asked one afternoon as they shared a bench in the small garden behind the center, a neglected area that James maintained in his spare time by planting flowers of his own accord. Yes, Daniel did it. The word came out more easily now that he was relaxed. Heart. Surgeon of the heart. It must have been incredible, James said thoughtfully, to literally hold human life in your hands, to make choices that mean someone lives or dies. He looked at his own hands, calloused and marked by decades of manual labor. I never had that kind of power. I only cleaned up after people with power were finished. No, it's not. Daniel struggled. The frustration rose. No, it's not. James waited patiently, without trying to finish the sentence, without showing impatience. This was one of the things Daniel appreciated most about him, the willingness to simply wait, to give space for the words to come at their own pace. It's not power. Daniel finally achieved it. It's responsibility. Wait. He gestured with his hands, trying to express what words cannot. Always fear. Fear of failure. James nodded slowly. So you carried weight every day. Responsibility for lives. And now you've lost that. And part of you feels relief mixed with loss, doesn't it? Daniel looked at him in surprise. No one had understood this. No one had verbalized the confusion of emotions he felt. Grief over the loss of purpose, yes. But there was also something darker, something he was ashamed to admit, a terrible relief at no longer having to carry that impossible weight. Yes, he whispered. Yes. How do you know? James smiled sadly. Because I carried my own weight, son. Different from yours, but no less heavy. He looked at the small garden. I served in Vietnam. 68 to 70. I saw things. I did things that no man should see or do. I came home with pieces of myself left in that jungle. Not pieces you can see, but pieces nonetheless. Daniel observed the older man, truly seeing him for the first time. The scars weren't just physical. They were there in his eyes, in the way James sometimes became very quiet, very distant. For a long time I couldn't work, James continued. I drank too much, fought too much, pushed away everyone who tried to help. I lost my wife, I lost my children, I lost years to drinking and anger. He paused, and then someone gave me a chance. Simple work, cleaning floors in a hospital. I said I didn't need to talk about what I saw in my head. I just needed to show up and do the job. So I showed up. Day after day, I showed up. And that helped. Daniel asked. It saved my life. James said simply. Not because the work was special or important in the eyes of the world, but because it gave me a reason to wake up. It gave me structure. It gave me a small but real purpose. Cleaning those floors meant that patients walked on clean ground. It meant that doctors and nurses could focus on their work without worrying about the environment. It meant that I was contributing, even in a small way. But you were. Daniel searched for the word. Soldier. Hero. James shook his head firmly. He wasn't a hero. He was a scared kid who did what he was told and was lucky to survive. And being a hero isn't about what you did before, Daniel. It's about who you choose to be now, today, in this moment. He looked directly into Daniel's eyes. You were a surgeon. That was beautiful and important, but it isn't anymore. So who are you now? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Daniel had no answer. He didn't know who he was beyond the title he had lost, beyond the identity that had defined his entire adult life. I don't know, he admitted, and for the first time since the surgery, he felt tears burning his eyes. I don't know who I am. I don't know what to do, how to live like this. James placed his gentle but firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Then we discovered it together. One day at a time. One step at a time. No rush, no pressure. We just discovered it. And that's what they started doing. James, in his free time, began to include Daniel in his world. Not in an intrusive or forced way, but naturally, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I need to plant these bulbs before the cold weather arrives, James would mention casually. Want to help me? No need to talk, just dig. And Daniel, with nothing better to do and strangely drawn to the quiet, non-judgmental company, helped. He knelt on the ground with his good hand, dug simple holes, placed bulbs, and covered them with soil. Work a child could do, but work that had tangible results. These flowers will grow in the spring, James would say. You help plant life. That means something. Or James would mention, the hallways on the third floor need waxing. Tedious work. The company would make it more bearable. And Daniel would go, watching James work with unwavering meticulousness, eventually picking up a cloth and helping to polish the areas his limited coordination allowed. The work was simple, repetitive, and precisely for that reason meditative. His mind, always running in circles of self-deprecation and regret, calmed down. In the repetitive movement of polishing the floor, there was a strange peace. Through these small acts of shared work, through hours spent in silent companionship broken by intermittent conversations that James never rushed, something began to change in Daniel. There was no dramatic cure, no sudden transformation, but small, incremental changes. He woke up some mornings, without that crushing weight of futility. He found himself thinking about something beyond his loss. He began to notice things, small, beautiful things he had been blind to before. The way sunlight filtered through the dirty downtown windows, the smell of fresh earth in James's garden, the sound of children laughing from the playground next door. James never pushed. He never demanded progress or improvement. He was simply present, consistent, offering friendship without conditions or expectations. And ironically, that was exactly what Daniel needed. But not everyone saw the relationship in the same way. It was during one of the therapy sessions that the social worker, Jennifer, a woman in her 40s with impatient efficiency, pulled Daniel aside. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice low but firm. "What?" Daniel asked, feeling the tension rising. "I've noticed you spend a lot of time with James, the caretaker," she said carefully. "And I understand that perhaps you've found some comfort in his friendship. But Daniel," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "you need to focus on building relationships with people in your own social sphere. Other medical professionals who are going through rehabilitation. People who understand your background and can relate to your specific experiences." "James, I understand," Daniel said, feeling anger beginning to boil, a rare emotion in the last few months of dormancy. "I'm sure he's kind," Jennifer continued. "But he's a janitor, Daniel. He's not educated. He doesn't have the context to understand what you've lost. You were a surgeon. You need peer support. Not," she gestured vaguely, "not someone so different from you." The fury Daniel felt at that moment was the first strong emotion in months that wasn't despair or self-pity. "James," she said, with barely disguised disdain, "is more." Daniel struggled with words, frustration making it harder. "He's more human than all of you." "Daniel, be reasonable." "No," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in months. "James sees me. Person. No. Not a victim. No. Patient. Person." He stared at her. All of you see problem. Project. He sees friend." Jennifer sighed, clearly unconvinced, but realizing that pushing further would be counterproductive. "Just be careful, okay? Don't place too many expectations on this friendship. People from such different backgrounds rarely maintain long-term connections." Daniel simply turned his back and left, searching for James, desperately needing the calm, non-judgmental presence of the man who had become his anchor in a world that had lost all meaning. He found James in the janitor's storeroom, organizing cleaning supplies with the same meticulous attention he applied to everything. James looked up, saw something in Daniel's face, and immediately put aside what he was doing. "What happened?" he asked gently. Daniel recounted the events, his words coming out difficult, but eventually forming a coherent story. He told of what Jennifer had said, about the implication that their friendship was somehow inappropriate or unsustainable because of differences in class and education. James listened quietly, then sighed. "She's not entirely wrong, you know." "What?" Daniel looked surprised, feeling something akin to betrayal. "We're different," James said calmly. "I have a high school education. You have multiple advanced degrees. I clean floors. You saved lives. We've seen the world from completely different angles." He met Daniel's eyes. "But you know what I've learned in 72 years on this planet? These differences only matter if you stop caring. Humanity doesn't have degrees. Pain doesn't respect diplomas. And friendship, true friendship, doesn't give a damn about how much money you make or what uniform you wear." "So still friends?" Daniel asked, hating the vulnerability in his voice, but unable to hide it. James smiled, that warm smile that had become even more precious to Daniel. "Son, I'm here until you send me away. And even then, I'll probably still show up. I'm stubborn like that." The relief Daniel felt was disproportionate to the moment, but revealing of how much he had come to depend on this friendship, this connection with a man whom society considers insignificant, but who had become more important to him than any of the prestigious colleagues who had distanced themselves after he was no longer useful to them. "Thank you," Daniel said simply, "for everything, for seeing me." "Always," James replied. "And Daniel," he added, "that social worker, she comes from a place of care, even if it's misguided. But don't let anyone, tell you who you can or can't be friends with. You've already lost enough. Don't lose your autonomy to choose your own connections either. And at that moment, in the janitor's warehouse smelling of cleaning products and honest work, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since before the surgery. He felt valued, not for who he was or what he could do, but simply for being himself. Do you want to know what happens when Daniel finally finds purpose again? When he discovers that sometimes the life we save is our own. Leave a comment telling us who the unexpected person was who changed your life. And hit that like button now. Months passed, and the friendship between Daniel and James deepened in ways neither of them anticipated. What began as occasional conversations and shared work evolved into something deeper, more meaningful. James became not only a friend but a mentor, a guide through the uncharted territory of rebuilding identity from scratch. It was James who suggested, on a cold November afternoon, while sharing terrible coffee from the center's machine, that Daniel consider volunteering, not medicine. He quickly clarified, seeing panic in Daniel's eyes. Something different, something without pressure, just using his time in a way that helps others. Like what? Daniel asked, genuinely curious, but also apprehensive. James thought for a moment. You know how to read and write, even with your speech difficulties. I know a homeless shelter 3 blocks from here. They always need help. Serving food, organizing donations, sometimes just sitting and listening to people's stories. Simple work, but important. He looked at Daniel, and maybe seeing other people struggling, other people who have lost things, will help you see your own situation differently. Daniel initially resisted the idea of entering a new environment, meeting new people who would have to deal with his broken speech and uncoordinated movements, was terrifying. But James, with infinite patience, continued gently suggesting until Daniel agreed to at least visit. The Haven House shelter was an old building, poorly heated in winter, with rows of cramped bunk beds, a communal kitchen operating with old equipment, and a diverse clientele of people whom life had knocked down. There were veterans with PTSD, recovering addicts, families who had lost everything in economic crises, people with mental illnesses without access to adequate care. It was a microcosm of all the ways life could break people. The director, an energetic 50-year-old woman named Rosa, assessed Daniel with experienced eyes that had seen it all. You can start in the kitchen, she said pragmatically. Help prepare and serve meals. You don't need to talk much. Just show up consistently. These people need consistency. And Daniel showed up, Tuesdays and Thursdays after therapy sessions, and occasionally Saturdays as well. He chopped vegetables with his functional hand, slowly and awkwardly, but functionally. He served food on trembling trays that occasionally spilled sauce, but which people received gratefully nonetheless. He cleaned tables after everyone had eaten, working alongside other volunteers who quickly learned not to talk to him as if he were incapable just because he spoke differently. And something remarkable happened. Among the people in the shelter, his speech impediment wasn't strange or uncomfortable. Many of them had their own struggles, their own limitations. One man had lost his leg in a construction accident. One woman had burned scars, covering half her face. Another man had tremors worse than Daniel's, due to neurological damage from an overdose. Here, being broken wasn't the exception. It was the norm. And that, strangely, was liberating. Conversations began. Simple at first, just basic exchanges. But gradually, as Daniel became a regular presence, people began to open up. An elderly veteran named Marcus shared war stories he had never told anyone, finding in Daniel someone who understood trauma viscerally. A single mother named Keisha, living in the shelter with 2 young children after fleeing an abusive relationship, asked Daniel for help filling out job applications, trusting him despite his trembling hands because he was patient and kind. And through these interactions, something inside Daniel began to heal. Not his speech, which remained difficult, not his motor coordination, which improved only incrementally, but something deeper, his sense of worth, his purpose. He was helping again, not in the grand, dramatic way of life-saving surgery, but in small, quiet ways that still mattered. Perhaps they mattered even more because they were personal, direct, human. James would occasionally come to the shelter as well, on his days off, helping with repairs that the place perpetually needed. And he would watch Daniel with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener, seeing planted seeds finally sprout. "You look different," James remarked one day as they repaired a broken door hinge. "Lighter, as if you'd put some weight on the floor." "I think I put it on," Daniel admitted. "The weight of being more, of having to be special, important." He struggled with words, but James waited patiently. "Here I just help. Simple. And enough." James smiled. "That's the wisdom that took me decades to learn. You got there faster than I did." But it was during a particularly cold night in December that everything changed again, this time in a way that would test both Daniel and James in ways they hadn't expected. The shelter was packed, every bunk occupied, people sleeping on mattresses on the floor because it was below freezing outside and no one would be turned away. Daniel was helping distribute extra blankets when he heard a commotion near the entrance. A man had just entered, young, perhaps 25, trembling uncontrollably not only from the cold but from something else. His eyes were wild, his speech incoherent, his movements spasmodic and uncoordinated. Overdose, Daniel recognized immediately with the medical instinct that never truly died. Or severe withdrawal. Possibly both. Rosa was trying to calm the man down, but he was becoming more agitated, pushing her, shouting nonsensical things, clearly in crisis. Other residents of the shelter were backing away, some frightened, others simply too tired of their own problems to get involved. And Daniel, without thinking, without planning, moved forward. His body remembered what to do even though his words couldn't command it. He approached the man with raised hands, a non-threatening posture, moving slowly and deliberately. "Okay," he said, his voice calm despite the difficulty. "Okay. Safe. You are safe." The man turned to face him, his eyes focusing and unfocusing. Who are you?" "Daniel," he said simply. "Doctor." He was a doctor. "To help. I want to help." Something in Daniel's calmness, in the medical authority he still carried even through his broken speech, pierced the man's panic. He faltered, tremors continuing but aggression diminishing. I'm not okay. I need help." "I know," Daniel said gently. "Let's sit down. Look at you." "Okay." He guided the man to a chair, sat down in front of him, and began the assessment that his years of training had made second nature. Dilated pupils, check. Pulse, rapid but regular. Breathing, shallow but adequate. Tremors, severe but no convulsions. His medical mind cataloged symptoms even as his hands, those trembling hands that could no longer hold a scalpel, checked vital signs with a touch that still resembled precision. "Ambulance," he told Rosa, without taking his eyes off the patient. "Now. Possible overdose. Needs the hospital." While they waited for the ambulance, Daniel stayed with the man, speaking softly, keeping him calm, monitoring his condition. And he felt, for the first time since the surgery, that familiar adrenaline rush of a medical situation. Not panic, but heightened focus. Purpose. When the paramedics arrived and took the man away, Rosa touched Daniel's arm. "You saved him," she said quietly. "He was climbing toward something dangerous. You brought him back." "I just did what I was trained for," Daniel said, but he felt something expanding in his chest. Something like pride. Not the arrogant pride of a surgeon who dramatically saved a life, but a quiet pride in having helped when it mattered, in having used skills he still had, despite all the ones he had lost. James arrived a few minutes later, having heard about the incident. He found Daniel sitting alone, his hands still trembling, but not from neurological dysfunction this time, just residual adrenaline. "I heard what you did," James said, sitting down next to him. "It wasn't much," Daniel began, but James gently interrupted him. "That was all. For that man, at that moment, that was all that mattered." He looked directly at Daniel. "Do you see now? You didn't stop being a doctor when you could no longer operate. You just became a different kind of doctor, the kind that heals in other ways." Daniel looked at his own hands, those hands that had once held human hearts, that had stitched arteries with microscopic precision, that now trembled and faltered, but that could still touch, comfort, assess, help. I think so, he said slowly. I think I can still be useful. Different, but useful. Son, James said with that warm smile. You've always been useful. You just needed to see it differently. He paused. Being a doctor isn't about scalpels or operating rooms. It's about healing. And healing has 1,000 forms. You're finding yours. That night, when Daniel returned to his small apartment, he didn't feel the crushing weight of futility he had carried for months. He felt something different. He felt possibility. He felt purpose. Not the grand, defined purpose I had before, but something more flexible, more human, more sustainable. And he realized that James, that janitor whom society ignored, that man without sophisticated diplomas or impressive titles, had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Value doesn't come from what you do or how impressive you seem to others. It comes from showing up, from caring, from using what you have, no matter how imperfect, to make a difference where you can. But the journey wasn't over yet, because sometimes, when you finally learn to receive help, the universe gives you a chance to reciprocate in ways you never imagined. Are you seeing the transformation? Feeling how purpose can be rediscovered in unexpected ways? Leave a comment about the moment you rediscovered your worth. And if you need to see how Daniel finally repays the man who saved him, hit that like button. January brought a brutal cold snap, and with it, a crisis that no one anticipated. James didn't show up for work on a Tuesday, which was completely out of character for a man who hadn't missed a single day in 10 years. Daniel, who had gone to the community center specifically to see his friend, felt an immediate unease. "Where's James?" he asked the building supervisor, an impatient man who clearly saw the janitors as replaceable. "He called in sick," the supervisor said indifferently. "First time in years. Probably just the flu. He'll be back when he gets better." But something in Daniel's instinct, that medical instinct that never truly slept, began to sound the alarm. James wasn't the type of person to miss work for a simple cold. And most importantly, James lived alone in a small apartment. If he were truly ill, who would be there to take care of him? "Address," Daniel demanded. "James, I need his address." The supervisor hesitated, citing privacy policies, but something in Daniel's urgency, in the medical authority he still carried even through broken speech, made him relent. He scribbled an address on a piece of paper. James's apartment was in a poor neighborhood, a 4-story building without an elevator, peeling paint, and rusty exterior stairs. Daniel slowly climbed to the 3rd floor, his limited coordination making the stairs treacherous, but determination propelled him forward. He knocked on the door of apartment 3C. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. "James," he called. "James, it's Daniel. You okay?" A faint sound came from inside, something between a moan and an attempt to speak. Daniel tried the doorknob. Locked. His heart raced. "James, I'm going to come in." "Okay. I need to see you." He stepped back and, using his shoulder, forced the door. The old lock gave way on the 3rd blow. The apartment was small, impeccably clean even in sickness, with minimal but well-kept furnishings. And on the narrow sofa in the living room, curled up under a blanket, was James. Daniel knew immediately that it was serious. James's skin was gray. Sweat covered his forehead. His breathing was shallow and labored. His left hand clutched his chest, his fingers stiff in obvious pain. "Heart," Daniel assessed instantly. "Heart attack, possibly ongoing for hours." He knelt beside the sofa, hands already moving to check his pulse. Weak, irregular. Not good. Not good at all. "James," Daniel said urgently. "How long? When did it start?" James opened his eyes with difficulty. "This morning," he whispered. "I thought just indigestion, but it got worse. I didn't want to bother you." "Idiot," Daniel said with desperate affection. "You idiot." He was already picking up the phone, dialing emergency with trembling but determined fingers. "I need an ambulance," he told the operator, forcing clarity through the panic. "Heart attack. Ongoing. Man 70, 2 years old. Weak pulse. Chest pain. Breathing difficult." He gave the address. "Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Ambulance on the way. Do you have medical training?" He was a surgeon, Daniel said. A cardiac surgeon. I know what to do. And he knew. Even with trembling hands, even with faltering speech, the knowledge was there, engraved so deeply that no stroke could erase it. He kept James conscious, monitored his vital signs, positioned him for better blood flow, offered constant comfort through words that struggled to come out, but carried all the care he felt. "Stay with me," he repeated. "James, stay with me. You won't leave me. Do you understand? You saved me. Now it's my turn." James tried to smile through the pain. "He always knew you. We're still a doctor." "I always was," Daniel realized with sudden clarity. "You showed me. I never stopped. I just changed." The ambulance arrived an eternity of 12 minutes later. Paramedics rushed upstairs, medical equipment banging. When they entered, they found Daniel crouched beside James, keeping him steady, monitoring every breath, every beat of his faltering heart. "I'm Dr. Daniel Torres," he told the paramedics, medical authority returning despite his slurred speech. "Cardiac surgeon. Retired. This man presents with myocardial infarction. History unknown. But symptoms classic. Needs catheterization." Now, the paramedics, trained to recognize medical knowledge, when they saw it, heard it, they made their own assessments while preparing James for transport, but incorporated Daniel's observations, his timeline of symptoms, and his treatment recommendations. "Are you coming?" a paramedic asked as they placed James on the stretcher. "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. He climbed into the ambulance, held James's hand during the frantic drive to the hospital, the same hospital where he had performed 1,000 surgeries, where he had been a respected doctor, where he had lost everything. But he wasn't returning as a victim this time. He was returning as a doctor. Different, broken in some ways, but still a doctor. Still a healer. Still someone who fought for lives that mattered. At Metropolitan Hospital, former colleagues recognized Daniel at the emergency room doors. The shock on their faces was obvious, but there was no time for awkward meetings. James was in crisis, and Daniel, with an authority he hadn't exercised in months, began giving medical information to the emergency team. Dr. Sarah Chun, a cardiologist who had trained under Daniel years ago, took on the case. She listened as Daniel, struggling through every word but refusing to give up, provided critical history, observations, and recommendations based on knowledge that transcended his physical limitations. "Let's take him for catheterization," Sarah decided. "You read that right, Daniel. Severe blockage. But we caught it in time." She looked at him with a respect that had nothing to do with pity. "Good job, doctor." And those words, doctor, spoken not condescendingly, but with genuine professional respect, healed something in Daniel that he didn't know was still broken. The surgery took 3 hours. Daniel waited in the waiting room he knew intimately. Terrible coffee from the machine cooling untouched in his hands. And while he waited, people began to appear. Rosa from the shelter, having somehow heard. Marcus, the veteran, with other residents. Jennifer, the social worker, with an expression that mixed surprise and something akin to shame. They had all come for James, but they stayed for Daniel as well, because they had seen something in him that he was only beginning to see in himself. He was no longer the brilliant surgeon he had been, but he was something perhaps more valuable. He was a man who had lost everything, been completely broken, and was rebuilding not a perfect version of who he was, but something new, something more human, something that understood fragility and strength in equal measure. Sarah finally came out, still in her surgical scrubs. "He's stable," she announced. "We placed 2 stents. The prognosis is good. He'll need cardiac rehabilitation, lifestyle changes, but he'll recover." She smiled at Daniel. "You saved his life. If you had waited another hour, it would have been too late." Daniel felt tears burning, but not of sadness this time. Of relief, of gratitude, of something greater. "Can I see him?" "As soon as I wake up from the anesthesia," Sarah promised. "Daniel," she added hesitantly, "it was good to see you back here. Even though it's different now. You were an inspiration to so many of us. You still are." When Daniel was finally able to enter the recovery room, James was awake, pale but alive. his monitors beeping steadily. His eyes met Daniel's, and he smiled weakly. "You brought me back," James whispered. "You brought me here first," Daniel replied, sitting down beside the bed. "I was just returning the favor." James chuckled weakly, then grimaced in pain. "I guess we're even then." "Never," Daniel said firmly. "Never even. You gave me life back. Not the old one. Something better. More real." The following days were a blur of hospital visits, coordinating care, ensuring James had the support he needed for recovery. And through it all, Daniel found himself a doctor again in ways he hadn't been able to before. Not performing complex procedures, but advocating for patients, navigating the medical system, offering knowledge and experience to ensure the best outcome. Rosa offered James recovery at the shelter, where he could be monitored. Other volunteers organized shifts to ensure he was never alone. And Daniel, who had started as someone needing to be saved, became a care coordinator, using every skill he still had, every bit of medical knowledge, to ensure the man who had saved him had everything he needed. 2 months later, on a clear March morning, Daniel and James sat in the garden behind the community center. James was weaker, moving more slowly, but alive and improving daily. The bulbs they had planted together in the fall were sprouting, new green pushing through the still cold earth. "Do you know what I've learned?" Daniel said, the words coming more easily now after months of constant practice. "I've learned that losing something doesn't mean losing everything. I lost surgery, but I didn't lose medicine. I didn't lose the ability to heal. And what are you going to do with it?" James asked. Daniel had thought about it a lot. "There's a free clinic 3 blocks from here. They need volunteer medical consultants, people who understand medicine but don't necessarily need to operate. Just diagnose, advise, connect patients with the right care." He looked at James. "I thought about volunteering." James smiled, that smile that had become more precious to Daniel than any professional recognition had ever been. "I think it would be perfect. A different kind of surgery. Surgery of systems, of lives. No less important. Just different." "And you?" Daniel asked. "What are you going to do? Retire?" James shook his head. "I can still push the mop. Just slower. Besides," he added with a glint in his eyes, "someone needs to keep this place clean. And keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't get lost trying to save the world all by yourself." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun warmed the air around them and bulbs continued to push toward the light. 2 broken people who found each other at the right moment, who saved each other in ways that transcended medical definitions of saving. Daniel had lost everything after surgery. Hands that defined who he was. A voice that articulated his genius. An identity he had built over decades. But through this devastating loss, through the despair that almost consumed him, he had found something he never would have discovered otherwise. "I had learned that human value isn't about perfection or ability. It's about showing up, caring, using what you have, no matter how broken, to touch other lives. I had learned that sometimes you need to lose the version of yourself you thought you needed to be in order to discover the version you truly are." And he had learned that angels come in all forms, sometimes in white coats in operating rooms, and sometimes in faded blue uniforms, pushing cleaning carts through corridors the world ignores. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, "for everything, for seeing when I was invisible, for staying when everyone else left, for showing me that I'm still someone." James placed his hand on his shoulder. "You've always been someone, son. You just needed to remember how to see yourself through different eyes. Not eyes that measure worth by titles or abilities, but eyes that see heart, soul, humanity. Those never change. Those you never lose." When spring finally arrived in full force, the bulbs they had planted burst into vibrant colors, transforming the small, neglected garden into something beautiful. People began to notice, to stop, to appreciate. Staff at the center took breaks there. Patients found comfort in the unexpected beauty. And Daniel, observing flowers that had grown from seeds planted in his darkest spot, understood the metaphor perfectly. Sometimes you need to be buried. You need to sit in darkness and cold. You need to be completely broken before you can sprout into something new, something different from what it was. but no less beautiful, no less valuable, just different, and perhaps, just perhaps, more truly alive than it has ever been before. Are your eyes welling up with tears? Feeling the weight of this transformation? Leave a comment telling us who your James was, who saw you when you were invisible. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that value isn't in perfection but in humanity, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share it. Because in a world that tells us we only matter if we're perfect, stories like this need to be told. Stories that remind us that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. See you on the next journey, where we'll continue exploring the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit.